My boyfriend asked me to send my kids away so he could film his videos in peace. He never expected me to pack the wrong person's bags. I'm Maya Bennett, 35 years old, and I've always lived by one rule. Some priorities are negotiable, but others never will be. My children, Leo, 8, and Sophie, 6, have always come first. After them comes my career as a forensic accountant, the job that keeps the lights on and pays the mortgage. Next is the colonial house I spent 5 exhausting years renovating into a place my children could always call home. Somewhere below all of that was my boyfriend, Tristan Cole. Tristan was 29, charming enough to earn a stranger's trust within minutes, and photogenic enough to convince thousands of followers that his life was effortlessly perfect. He called himself a lifestyle consultant, though most of his work involved arranging elaborate charcuterie boards, filming sponsored unboxing videos, and chasing the best natural light for social media. When we met 14 months earlier, I truly believed he understood what dating me meant. He wasn't just dating a woman who happened to have children, he was dating a mother, and I assumed he understood the difference. 6 months into the relationship, Tristan moved into my house. Looking back, I should have seen it sooner. Not because he did anything dramatic. Because he didn't. It was always something small. I almost stepped on another toy. Do they really need cartoons this loud? The fingerprints on the glass table drive me crazy. I wish the living room looked a little cleaner. Individually, none of those comments sounded unreasonable, so I adjusted. I hired a cleaning service twice a week instead of once, reminded Leo to put away his backpack as soon as he walked through the door, and asked Sophie to lower the volume on her cartoons. I convinced myself this was simply part of learning to live together. What I didn't realize was that every compromise made the next one easier. It wasn't just the toys anymore, or the fingerprints, or the noise. Little by little, I was teaching my own children to take up less space in the home that was supposed to belong to them. It took me far too long to recognize what was really happening. My custody arrangement with my ex-husband, Daniel Bennett, had never been complicated. We shared Leo and Sophie equally, alternating 1 week with me and 1 week with him. There were no courtroom battles, no screaming matches, and no endless arguments over holidays. We weren't close friends, but we respected each other enough to put our children ahead of our pride, and for years, that had been enough. The tension in my relationship with Tristan had nothing to do with Daniel. It started and ended with one simple fact: my children existed. Whenever Leo and Sophie laughed too loudly, Tristan's expression tightened. If they left crayons on the dining table or forgot a pair of shoes by the front door, he'd sigh as though someone had ruined a carefully staged showroom instead of a family home. Even then, I kept making excuses for him. I told myself he was still adjusting to life with children. I was wrong. The conversation that ended our relationship happened on an ordinary Tuesday while I was making lasagna, one of Leo's favorite dinners. He always insisted the crispy corner pieces were the best, while Sophie argued that the soft middle slices tasted better. They had the same debate almost every custody week, and I caught myself smiling as I layered the noodles into the baking dish. Across the kitchen, Tristan sat at the island with one leg crossed over the other, absent-mindedly swirling an expensive glass of red wine while scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up until he let out a long, theatrical sigh I'd come to recognize. It was the sound he made whenever he'd already decided how a conversation was going to end before it even began. Maya, I glanced over. Yeah? We should talk about the calendar. I spread another layer of ricotta and asked, Okay, what's coming up? It's about tomorrow. I frowned. What about tomorrow? The kids. My hand stopped moving. They're coming home. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he set down his wine glass and said, I've been thinking, maybe you should ask Daniel to switch weeks, or have him keep the kids a little longer. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. Why would I do that? They don't need to stay here every week. I slowly put the spoon down and turned to face him. This is my custody week. I know. They live here. He shrugged before taking another sip of wine. I've got several campaigns to film this week. I need the living room. You have the house to yourself until 3 every afternoon. It's not about the schedule. Then what is it? He finally looked me in the eye. It's the atmosphere. I waited for him to explain. They're loud. They're children. They leave toys everywhere. They're playing. They interrupt my recordings. They're in elementary school, I replied, struggling to understand why he thought any of this was unusual. He rubbed his forehead as if I were missing the point. Maya, I'm trying to build something here. So am I. No, you're not listening. I am. I need this house to feel peaceful. It already is. He shook his head. Not when they're here. The kitchen fell silent. The lasagna sat unfinished on the counter while the oven beeped to let me know it had finished preheating. Neither of us moved. After a long pause, Tristan leaned forward. If we're serious about building a future together, this house has to become ours. I stared at him. It still feels like it's theirs. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood what he meant. They're my children. I know. This is their home. I know. But they're here too much. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. I think they should start coming every other weekend instead. I didn't respond. Tristan mistook my silence for hesitation and kept going. Daniel's their father. He should be doing most of the parenting anyway. At that moment, something inside me went completely still. Every complaint he'd made over the past 6 months came back at once. The toys, the fingerprints, the cartoons. None of it had ever been about the mess. It had been about making my children take up less space. Most investigations take days of digging through financial records, but every now and then, a single transaction connects every loose end. One detail suddenly explains every inconsistency, and the entire picture becomes impossible to ignore. Tristan had never been trying to join my family. He'd been trying to shrink it. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, turned to face him, and spoke as calmly as I could. So let me make sure I understand. He gave me a small, confident smile. Okay, you don't want my children staying in their own home. He shrugged as though he were saying something perfectly reasonable. I just think we need healthier boundaries. I nodded once. I hear you. The relief on his face was immediate. He smiled, reached for his wine again, and said, I knew you'd understand. We'll finally have time for ourselves. We can travel more, have real date nights, and the house can finally feel like... You're right. He stopped mid-sentence. Without another word, I walked to the drawer beside the refrigerator where we kept the spare keys, removed his key from the hook, and placed it on the counter between us. We're done. The smile disappeared from his face. What? Our relationship is over. He let out a nervous laugh. Seriously? Completely. You're being dramatic. No, I'm finally being honest. It was just a conversation. No, Tristan, it was much more than that. I never said I hated your kids. You asked me to push my children out of their own home so you could have better lighting for your videos. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. Maya, I choose them. He frowned. What? I choose my children, and I always will. I never raised my voice because I didn't need to. I'd already decided. So you're choosing them over me? Every single time, I answered. There isn't a situation where I'd choose anyone else over my children. I held his gaze for another moment before quietly adding, as far as I'm concerned, this relationship ended the second you suggested my kids should feel like visitors in the house I built for them. He stared at me as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. When he finally spoke again, all the warmth had disappeared from his voice. So where exactly do you expect me to go? I suggest you start packing. For several seconds, Tristan simply stared at me before laughing. It wasn't because he found anything funny. He genuinely believed I couldn't be serious. Oh, come on, he scoffed. You're ending a 14-month relationship over one conversation? I'm ending it because that conversation showed me exactly who you are. You always overreact. I shook my head. No, I've just stopped making excuses for you. His expression hardened. You can't throw me out. I'm asking you to leave. I live here. You've been living here, but those aren't the same thing. I have rights. You've never paid rent. I still contributed. Groceries once in a while. That was about it. Everything else was mine. He folded his arms. This is my home too. I slowly looked around the kitchen before answering. I bought this house years before we met. I paid for it, renovated it, and I've covered every mortgage payment since day one. For the first time since the conversation began, he ran out of words. After a long pause, he finally muttered, You can't just kick me out overnight. I didn't say overnight. I need time. You'll have it. His expression softened slightly, as if he thought I was beginning to reconsider. So, we can work this out? He asked, his expression softening, as though my answer had already changed. No. Maya, we've built a life together. We lived in the same house, Tristan. That's not the same thing. You don't mean this. I've never meant anything more. His face tightened. So my relationship loses and your kids win? This isn't a competition. It obviously is. They're my children. They were never supposed to compete with you. I never said they had to. You asked me to reduce their time here because their presence interferes with your videos. That's exactly what you did. He rolled his eyes. That's not fair. It was one suggestion. That wasn't about scheduling. It told me exactly who you are. He opened his mouth to argue, but I kept going. You didn't ask me to change a dinner reservation or postpone a trip. You asked me to make my children less welcome in their own home. I never used the word unwelcome. You said they shouldn't stay here every week. They don't need to. They absolutely do. He rubbed his forehead. You still aren't listening. I've been listening for 6 months. That's why every complaint makes sense now. The fingerprints, the toys, the cartoons, the crumbs, the shoes by the door, the backpacks, all of it. I thought you were adjusting to family life. Instead, I was adjusting my children to fit your lifestyle. That finally stopped him. After a long pause, he asked, So that's really it? Yes. You aren't even willing to compromise? I already did. You just never noticed. His brow furrowed. I changed our routines. I hired extra help. I kept asking my kids to be quieter. Somehow it was never enough. I never asked you to do all of that. Every time you complained, I changed something. Then you found something new to complain about. He shook his head. You're twisting everything. No, I'm finally seeing it clearly. His voice hardened. I'm not leaving. I thought you might say that. You can't force me out. I'm not going to force you. Then I'll stay. That's your decision. He gave me a challenging look. Go ahead, call the police. I don't need to. His eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means tomorrow morning I'll handle this properly. A trace of confidence returned to his face. You don't scare me. I know tenant laws. So do I. I'm serious. So am I. Then something in his expression changed. The anger faded and left behind something colder. If you try anything, he said, stepping closer, I'll tell the police you put your hands on me. I stared at him. I'll say you threatened me. I'll make sure people believe me. Until then, I'd thought Tristan was selfish and entitled. In that moment, I understood he was also willing to invent an abuse claim if it helped him keep control. I didn't raise my voice or try to defend myself. Okay, he frowned. Okay? If that's what you're planning, then from now on, every interaction between us will be documented. His confidence slipped. What are you talking about? I won't argue with you, touch you, or give you any opportunity to rewrite what happened. Everything will be recorded or put in writing. He stared at me. You sound insane. I sound careful. I turned off the oven, covered the half-finished lasagna with foil, and put it in the refrigerator. What are you doing? He asked. Going out for dinner. You're running away? No, I'm done with this conversation. You made all that food. The kids can have it tomorrow. I picked up my keys and headed for the front door. You can't just leave in the middle of this. I already said everything I needed to say. Maya. I opened the door and looked back at him. You should use tonight to think carefully about what you do next. He gave a bitter laugh. I already am. So am I. I drove to a 24-hour diner about 15 minutes away. The waitress recognized me and brought over my usual coffee, cheeseburger, and fries. Normally, I would have answered emails while I ate. That night, I opened my laptop and researched landlord-tenant law instead. I read through the rules on occupancy, notice periods, access to shared spaces, utilities, personal property, and documentation until I understood exactly what I could and couldn't do. By the time I finished dinner, I had a plan. By the time I drove back into my driveway nearly 2 hours later, I had stopped thinking like someone going through a breakup. I was thinking like someone preparing for a legal dispute. The downstairs lights were off, making the house feel strangely unfamiliar. Inside, I found that Tristan had already moved his belongings into the guest room. The moment he heard me come in, he slammed the door without saying a word. I locked my bedroom before going to sleep. It wasn't because I was afraid of him. It was because someone willing to invent an abuse allegation was no longer someone I trusted to have unrestricted access to my private space. Sleep never really came. My mind kept drifting back to Leo and Sophie. By tomorrow afternoon, they'd walk through the front door expecting another ordinary custody week, completely unaware that someone had tried to convince me they no longer belonged there. I intended to keep it that way. Lying awake before dawn, I made myself one promise. No relationship, no matter how serious it seemed, would ever come before my children again. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. I hadn't slept much, but my emotions had settled. The breakup was over. From that point on, everything would be handled calmly, legally, and with documentation. When I walked into the kitchen, Tristan was standing at the counter making a smoothie in my Vitamix as though nothing had happened. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled. Morning. I poured myself a cup of coffee. Morning. He leaned against the counter and said, I've been thinking. I've decided to let last night go. You got emotional, and people say things they don't mean. I met his eyes over the rim of my coffee mug. I meant every word. His smile faded. You'll calm down eventually. I already have. You'll realize throwing away a relationship over your pride isn't worth it. This has nothing to do with pride. Then what? My children. He sighed. We're really doing this again? No, I said. We're finishing it. He frowned. What does that mean? It means I've already taken the next step. I opened my work bag, removed a folded document, and placed it on the counter in front of him. I served you this morning. He unfolded the papers, scanned the first page, then looked back at me in disbelief. What is this? A formal notice to vacate. You actually served me? At 6 this morning, I attached it to your guest room door and photographed it for my records. He flipped through the pages. 30 days? That's right. I thought you were bluffing. I don't bluff. He stared at me for a moment before asking, You spent all night planning my eviction? I spent the evening learning the law. He tossed the paperwork onto the counter. You're unbelievable. I'm prepared. I'm calling a lawyer. I think that's a good idea. For the first time, his confidence wavered. You really want to do this? No, but I'm willing to. He folded his arms. I'm a tenant. I agree. He blinked. You do? That's exactly why I followed the legal process instead of arguing with you. That clearly wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd expected another emotional fight, not formal paperwork. So what happens now? Now we establish boundaries. What kind of boundaries? You'll continue using the guest room, the guest bathroom, and the shared kitchen. You'll still have water, electricity, and heat, but you won't have access to my bedroom, my office, my groceries, my subscriptions, or any of my personal property. His expression hardened. You can't do that. I already have. I walked to the networking cabinet in the hallway, unplugged the Wi-Fi router, and slipped it into my work bag. What are you doing? The internet account is in my name. You can't disconnect it. I can. I have sponsorship deadlines. Then you'll need to arrange your own internet service. He stared at me. You're serious? Completely. I work from home. So do millions of other people. They pay for their own internet. He stepped toward me. Maya. I shook my head before he could continue. You know I need Wi-Fi. And I know you threatened to accuse me of abuse if I asked you to leave. He immediately fell silent. You weren't supposed to take that seriously. I took it exactly as seriously as it deserved. From that moment on, I treated every word like evidence. I slipped the router into my work bag. You're unbelievably petty, Tristan snapped. No, I said, meeting his eyes. I'm separating basic necessities from personal privileges. He pointed at my bag. Put it back. I'll see you tonight. With that, I walked out the door. At 2:45 that afternoon, I pulled into the elementary school's pickup lane. Leo climbed into the back seat first, proudly holding up a dinosaur book. Dad, let me borrow this. Sophie climbed in behind him with an even bigger smile. And I got a sticker today. For the first time since Tuesday night, I found myself smiling without forcing it. Sounds like I missed a pretty exciting day. The drive home felt wonderfully ordinary. They spent the whole drive talking over each other about school. As we turned into the driveway, Sophie looked toward the house. Is Tristan home? He is. Is he okay? I caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. He's going to be moving out soon. She accepted the answer without another question. Children have an amazing ability to sense when an adult isn't ready to explain everything. Inside, the house was quiet. Tristan stayed behind the closed guest room door while Leo dropped his backpack by the couch. Can we play Mario Kart? I smiled. You already know my answer? He grinned. Yes! Within minutes, the living room was filled with cheerful game music, the sound of controllers clicking, and Sophie's laughter every time her character drove straight into a wall. I stood in the kitchen making popcorn and realized something that made my chest tighten. For months, I'd been telling them to lower their voices, clean up immediately, and be extra careful, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because I'd been trying to keep Tristan comfortable. I'd been teaching them to apologize for existing. Around 5 o'clock, the guest room door suddenly flew open. Can you keep it down? Tristan shouted. I'm recording. The room fell silent. Leo lowered his controller. Sophie looked down at the floor. Seeing them react like that hurt far more than Tristan's words ever could. I walked across the room and stopped between him and the kids. They're being ridiculous, he complained. They're laughing, I replied. They're screaming. They're playing. I have work. So do I. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. My voice stayed calm. Don't ever raise your voice at my children again. His jaw tightened. They're disrupting me. They're children, Tristan. They're allowed to laugh. They're allowed to play. And they're allowed to exist in the home they actually live in. It's 5 o'clock. They're in the family room, and they haven't done a single thing wrong. He tried to look past me toward Leo. I'm talking to them. No, I said firmly. You're talking to me. The room went quiet again. After a few seconds, Tristan let out a frustrated scoff. This is unbelievable. I held his gaze. No, what's unbelievable is that 2 kids immediately stopped laughing because they were afraid an adult was angry with them. That should never happen in their own home. His expression darkened, but this time he didn't have an answer. You always make me the villain. You made that decision yourself. He looked around the room, finally realizing no one was taking his side. Not me, and certainly not the children. Without another word, he turned, walked back to the guest room, and slammed the door hard enough to rattle a picture frame on the wall. Sophie looked up at me. Are we in trouble? I knelt beside the couch and gently shook my head. No, sweetheart. Did we do something wrong? Absolutely not. Leo glanced toward the hallway. He seemed really mad. Sometimes adults get upset, I said softly, but you never have to apologize for laughing in your own home. Neither of them smiled right away. That hurt more than Tristan's outburst because it told me they'd already started believing they needed permission to simply be children. I picked up a controller and smiled at Leo. So, who's winning? I am. We'll see about that. A few minutes later, the laughter returned, filling the room exactly the way it should have. That evening, after Leo and Sophie had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same place where Tristan had asked me to trade my children's happiness for a quieter house. The lasagna was finally gone. Leo had eaten every crispy corner piece he could find, while Sophie had stubbornly defended the soft middle slices. They'd argued about it for 20 minutes before dissolving into laughter. It was loud, messy, and completely ordinary, and I realized it was the first family dinner in months that hadn't revolved around keeping Tristan comfortable. The next morning, my phone began buzzing before I'd even finished my coffee. One notification became several, and every one of them came from my firm's Google business page. That immediately caught my attention. As the owner of a forensic accounting practice, my reputation wasn't just important, it was the foundation of my business. I opened the reviews. Every review accused me of something different. Together, they painted the same lie. I wasn't shocked by what they said. I was struck by how obvious they were. Every profile looked brand new. No photos, no history. Just fake names posting reviews within minutes of each other. Most people would have panicked. I started documenting everything. Within 15 minutes, I'd mapped every account. They'd all been created within minutes of one another. Every review appeared during the same 20-minute window. He wasn't nearly as clever as he'd imagined. I walked upstairs and knocked on his door. Nothing. I knocked again. What? He called from inside. Open the door. I'm busy. So am I. A few seconds later, the door opened. Tristan still looked like he'd stepped out of one of his videos. His hair was perfect. His shirt was wrinkle-free. And his expression had that carefully rehearsed confidence he'd worn since the day we met. It just wasn't convincing anymore. What? I held up my phone. My business reviews. He barely looked at the screen. I don't know what you're talking about. You should. I don't. You're really going to stick with that? He folded his arms. Prove it. I almost laughed. I don't have to prove anything today, I said. If it comes to that, I'll prove it in court. His expression shifted. Court? I pulled a folded letter from my folder and handed it to him. His eyes stopped on the heading. Cease and desist demand. What's this? A draft my attorney reviewed. He gave a short, dismissive laugh. You're threatening me over a few online reviews? No, I'm giving you a chance to fix what you've already done. Their opinions. They accuse me of crimes. That's defamation. He looked away. I didn't write them. I didn't ask whether you wrote them, I replied. I asked whether you're going to remove them. I can't remove something I didn't post. Really? I turned my phone toward him. All 6 accounts were created within minutes of each other. Every review went live during the same 20-minute window, and they all stopped just as suddenly. During that entire time, you were the only person in this house. He shrugged. That's circumstantial. It's enough to get started. I have plenty more. The confidence he'd been clinging to started slipping. What else? Screenshots, timestamps, account records. If that's not enough, my attorney can subpoena the rest. He didn't answer. I pointed back at the screen. You have 1 hour. And if I don't, I add defamation to the lawsuit. His eyes narrowed. You weren't even planning to sue me. I wasn't. And now you are? If you leave me no choice. You can't sue someone over an opinion. You can when those opinions falsely accuse someone of criminal conduct and damage their business. He stared at me for several seconds before speaking again. You wouldn't. You still don't know me very well. He muttered something under his breath. I didn't ask what it was. I turned around and walked away. 53 minutes later, every fake review had disappeared. There was no apology, no explanation, just silence. For a moment, I thought he'd finally figured out where the line was. I was wrong. 3 days later, even though it wasn't my custody week, Leo and Sophie stopped by for ice cream before Daniel picked them up. They were racing around the backyard while I pretended not to notice Leo slowing down just enough to let his little sister catch him. I'd almost forgotten Tristan was even inside the house when a police cruiser rolled into my driveway. 2 officers stepped out. My stomach tightened, not because I was worried about myself, but because my children were watching. I smiled at them. Hey, why don't you 2 head inside for a minute? I'll be right in. Leo looked confused. Is something wrong? No, the adults just need to talk. Sophie quietly reached for her brother's hand and led him toward the back door. Only after they were safely inside did I walk over to the officers. The older one introduced himself. Ma'am, we received a report of a domestic disturbance. I had a feeling that might happen. He glanced up from his notebook. You were expecting us? Not today specifically, just eventually. He checked the report again. The caller says a man in the home is being held against his will and denied food and basic necessities. Would you like to come inside? I asked. The officers followed me toward the porch, but before we reached the front door, it flew open. Tristan hurried outside, looking like he'd rehearsed every second of what came next. She won't let me leave, he shouted. She controls everything. She cut off the internet, locked me out of parts of the house, and I don't even have any money. The younger officer waited until he finished. Do you have a key to the house? Can you leave whenever you want? Tristan hesitated. I don't have anywhere else to go. The officer nodded. I understand, but that's not the same thing. I unlocked my phone. Officer, I have security camera footage, a copy of the 30-day notice to vacate, and documentation showing he still has access to the kitchen, utilities, and every shared area of the house. The only spaces I've restricted are my private bedroom and my personal internet account. The older officer turned back to Tristan. Has she stopped you from leaving? No. Locked you inside a room? No. Physically assaulted you? Tristan hesitated again before answering. No. The officer closed his notebook. Then this is a civil matter. If you disagree with the eviction process, you'll need to take it to housing court. Based on what we've seen today, no crime has occurred. Tristan threw up his hands. But she's making my life miserable. The officer gave him a tired smile. Sir, being unpleasant isn't against the law. A few minutes later, the patrol car pulled away. Tristan watched it disappear before turning back to me. You manipulated them. No, I said calmly. I came prepared. You always have an answer. I think before I act. You've treated me like garbage ever since we broke up. I've treated you exactly the way you asked to be treated. What is that supposed to mean? You insisted you were a tenant, so I respected that. You threatened to accuse me of abuse, so I documented every conversation. Then you tried to damage my business, and I protected it. He opened his mouth as if he had another argument ready. Nothing came out. I stepped past him and unlocked the front door. This happened because you mistook compromise for surrender. I kept giving in, and you kept asking for more. He didn't answer. He just stood on the porch watching me walk inside. For the first time since all of this began, he no longer looked confident. He looked like someone who had finally realized his usual tactics weren't working. The next 2 days were surprisingly quiet. Tristan barely came out of the guest room, and for a while I let myself believe we might actually reach the end of the 30 days without another confrontation. I should have known better. Thursday evening, I came home carrying groceries and immediately heard unfamiliar voices coming from the living room. Men were laughing over loud music while glasses clinked together. When I rounded the corner, I found 3 strangers making themselves comfortable on my furniture. One had his shoes resting on my coffee table, another was pouring himself wine from a bottle I'd bought months earlier, and Tristan looked up from the couch with a casual smile. "Oh," he said, "you're home." Not one of the men stood up, not one of them apologized. Instead, one of them raised his wine glass at me like he owned the place. "You must be Maya." I ignored him and looked at Tristan. "Who are they?" "My friends. They're leaving." He leaned back on the couch and laughed. "I don't think so. They're my guests. You never asked if you could invite anyone into my house." "I'm a tenant," he said. "I checked." I set the grocery bags on the counter. "Did you?" "Guests are allowed." "Not here." He rolled his eyes. "You don't get to invent rules." "I don't have to. I own the house." One of the men smirked. "So what now? You going to call the cops?" "No." I smiled. "I'm going downstairs." Tristan frowned. "What for?" "You'll see." I walked into the basement, opened the electrical panel, and shut off the breakers feeding the living room. A second later, the television went dark, the music cut off, and confused voices drifted down the stairs. What happened? Did the power just die? My phone stopped charging. I opened a storage cabinet, grabbed the battery-powered Bluetooth speaker Leo and I had joked about months earlier, and pressed play. Scottish bagpipes exploded through the house. By the time I carried the speaker upstairs and set it in the hallway, conversation had become impossible. Tristan clamped his hands over his ears. "Maya!" I smiled. "My house, my speaker. If you're throwing a party without asking, you can enjoy my playlist." "This is insane." "I agree. Terrible place for a party." The novelty wore off quickly. One guest headed for the door, muttering that he'd had enough. Another followed without saying a word. The last one paused beside Tristan, shook his head, and muttered, "Good luck, man," before walking out. A few minutes later, the house was quiet again. Only Tristan remained. He marched toward me, furious. "You embarrassed me." "No, you embarrassed yourself." "You made me look crazy." "You invited strangers into someone else's home without permission. That part was entirely your decision." "I thought I was allowed." "You assumed you were." He stared at me for a long moment. "You actually enjoy this, don't you?" I shook my head. "I don't enjoy any of it. I just refuse to let you treat my home like it's yours." He looked like he wanted another argument, but nothing came out. After a few seconds, he turned, walked back to the guest room, and shut the door behind him. For the first time in days, the house was quiet. I hoped we'd finally reach the end. We hadn't. Friday evening, just after dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Interested in the coffee table. Is it still available?" I frowned. Coffee table? I hadn't listed anything for sale. Curious, I opened Facebook Marketplace. There it was. My vintage mid-century coffee table. $400. Pickup only. Seller. Tristan Cole. I stared at the listing for a few seconds before smiling. Not because it was funny, because Tristan had just made another mistake. Instead of reporting the listing, I created a temporary account and sent a message. "Still available?" His reply appeared almost immediately. "Yes. Can you pick it up tonight?" 6 works. Perfect. That was all I needed. At 5:55 that evening, I parked 2 houses away, walked quietly to my front door, and unlocked it. Inside, Tristan was dragging my coffee table toward the entrance. He froze the instant he saw me. Neither of us spoke. I nodded toward the table. "Going somewhere?" His hand slipped off the edge. "I was cleaning." I raised an eyebrow. "Cleaning?" "Yeah." Without saying a word, I turned my phone toward him. The marketplace listing was still open, along with the conversation arranging a 6 o'clock pickup. He only glanced at it once. That was enough. The confidence he'd been wearing all week quietly disappeared. "I can explain." "I hope so." "It's not what it looks like." I looked from the screen to my coffee table sitting halfway to the front door. "It looks exactly like what it is." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was just trying to see what someone would pay." "For my furniture?" I wasn't actually going to let anyone take it. The buyer was already on the way. I would have canceled. "When?" He opened his mouth, searching for an answer that never came. I stayed calm. "Do you understand that trying to sell someone else's property is a crime?" His shoulders sagged. "I know." "No," I said quietly. "I don't think you do." He lowered himself onto the couch and covered his face with both hands. For the first time since the breakup, he wasn't arguing or making excuses. He just looked exhausted. "I don't have anywhere else to go," he said after a while. I let him continue. "I've looked at apartments every day this week. Every place wants first month's rent, a security deposit, and application fees. I can't afford any of it." A bitter laugh escaped him. "You know what my brand actually earns?" "No." "About $200 a month." I frowned. "What happened to all those sponsorships?" "Most of them disappeared." "The vacations?" "Credit cards." "And the designer clothes?" I returned almost everything after filming. His gaze drifted around the room before settling on the floor. "This house made my life look successful." He kept staring at the floor. I thought about every argument we'd had. The fingerprints, Leo's toys, Sophie's cartoons. I'd spent months believing those things bothered him. They never had. The toys weren't the problem. Neither were the fingerprints. They ruined the version of his life he sold online. "I paid for almost everything," he said. I shook my head. "No, I chose to pay because I trusted you." Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I broke the silence. "I'll make you one offer." He slowly looked up. "If you're completely moved out by Sunday and sign a statement confirming you have no claim to this property, I won't pursue the fake reviews, today's attempted sale, or the earlier property damage." He searched my face. You'd really let it go? I'd rather have my peace back. What if I need money? I shook my head. I'll pay the moving truck directly, that's all. He stared at the floor for nearly a minute before giving a slow nod. Monday. I held out my hand. After a long hesitation, he took it. His handshake barely lasted a second before he let go. Sunday morning, a U-Haul truck pulled into my driveway exactly at 9 o'clock, just as we'd agreed. I'd already paid the rental company because I wanted this chapter of my life finished as quickly as possible. It wasn't a favor for Tristan. It was a way to avoid one more unnecessary argument. When I stepped outside with my coffee, he was already loading the first boxes into the truck. His designer sweatshirt was wrinkled, his sneakers were scuffed, and for the first time since we'd met, he looked less like a confident influencer and more like someone who'd finally run out of ways to pretend everything was fine. I nodded toward the truck. It's yours until 6. Thanks, he replied quietly. I sat on the porch with my coffee and a clipboard, watching every box leave. The first hour passed without any problems. He loaded boxes of clothes, camera gear, lighting equipment, kitchen supplies, and the rest of his belongings into the truck without saying much. The piece ended when he walked outside carrying a framed print from my hallway. That stays, I said. I bought the frame. The artwork belongs to me. So let me keep the frame. Fine, the frame is yours. The print isn't. He spent several frustrating minutes trying to separate the artwork from the frame before finally giving up. He left the print on the hallway table, carried the empty frame to the truck, and walked away muttering under his breath. Around noon, I noticed something else. No friends had shown up to help him. The people who'd happily enjoyed my wine a few nights earlier were nowhere to be found, and even his mother stayed away. His phone rang once. Hi, Mom! He listened quietly for a minute before ending the call. She has a migraine, he said, almost apologetically. I only nodded. Whether it was true or just another excuse didn't matter anymore. By 2 o'clock, the guest room was completely empty. The shelves were bare, the closet stood open, and only a few dusty outlines showed where furniture had once been. He loaded the final box into the truck, closed the cargo door, and walked back toward me. This place is going to feel empty, he said, looking around the yard. I glanced toward the front windows where Leo and Sophie's drawings were still taped to the glass. I don't think it will. You'll miss me eventually. I met his eyes without hesitation. No. You really believe that? I do. He searched my face for any sign of doubt, regret, or hesitation, but whatever he hoped to find wasn't there. So that's really it? He asked quietly. Yes. 14 months, just over? I shook my head. No, it ended the night you asked me to choose between you and my children. I wasn't asking that. You were. I just didn't recognize it until you finally said it out loud. He glanced toward the front door before speaking again. I honestly thought you'd forgive me. I probably will someday, I admitted. But forgiveness isn't the same as trust, and I can't trust someone who wanted my children to feel unwelcome in their own home. He lowered his eyes. I never thought you'd choose them that fast. A faint smile crossed my face. I didn't make that choice overnight. I made it the day they were born. Neither of us spoke after that. There was no anger left, no argument waiting to happen, just the quiet certainty that there was nothing more to say. Tristan reached into his pocket, placed the house key on the porch railing, and gave a small nod. I guess this is goodbye. Goodbye, Tristan. He climbed into the truck and started the engine. As he backed out of the driveway, he came close to clipping the mailbox before correcting the wheel and disappearing around the corner. I waited until the truck was out of sight before going back inside. The first thing I did was replace every exterior lock. I'd bought the new lock sets days earlier because I never intended to wonder whether he still had a spare key. Within an hour, every key Tristan had ever used was worthless. Only then did I begin checking the house. The living room looked fine. So did the kitchen, the laundry room, and the now empty guest bedroom. Then I opened the guest bathroom. Bright red nail polish had been poured into the sink, staining the porcelain, the drain, and the stopper. It wasn't an accident. It was one last attempt to leave a mark before walking away. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of anger, but because I'd reached the point where nothing he did surprised me anymore. After photographing the damage from every angle, I opened the move-out agreement we'd both signed. One sentence stood out immediately. The property must be returned without new damage. He'd broken that agreement. I sent a single text. I inspected the bathroom. The sink was deliberately damaged after we signed our agreement. Because you violated the move-out terms, I'll be moving forward with the property damage claim. You'll receive the paperwork shortly. His reply arrived less than a minute later. You promised you wouldn't sue me, I answered once. I promised not to if you honored the agreement. You chose not to. Then I blocked his number. Monday morning, I filed everything I'd collected over the past month. Photographs, receipts, repair estimates, screenshots of the fake reviews, marketplace messages, records of the damaged shoes, and documentation of the vandalized sink. Recovering the money was never the point. I wanted a clear record showing exactly what had happened. Actions have consequences, and I was done protecting someone from his own choices. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, so I checked Tristan's social media from a private browser. His latest post showed moving boxes stacked inside his mother's garage. The caption read, Sometimes leaving a toxic environment is the first step toward finding yourself. Below it were the hashtags #fresh start, #healing, and #new chapter. The comments were disabled. That told me more than the caption ever could. The following Wednesday, Leo and Sophie came home. The moment they stepped through the front door, Sophie looked around and asked, "Is Tristan gone?" "Yes," I said. "He moved out." The smile that spread across her face was one I hadn't seen in months. Leo dropped his backpack and immediately asked, "Can we build a giant fort, like with every couch cushion?" I looked around the living room and thought about how much energy I'd wasted trying to keep everything spotless. For months, I'd worried about toys being left out, blankets on the floor, and laughter carrying through the house because I was trying to keep someone else comfortable. I wasn't doing that anymore. "Use every cushion," I said. Within 20 minutes, the living room was unrecognizable. Blankets hung from dining chairs, pillows covered half the floor, stuffed animals guarded the entrance, and a tunnel connected the couch to the coffee table. It looked wonderfully chaotic. Leo crawled inside first. Sophie followed close behind. "Dad never lets us make one this big." I laughed. "Then let's make this one unforgettable." I carried 2 pizza boxes into the fort, and the 3 of us sat on the floor eating pepperoni and cheese slices while crumbs collected everywhere. Sophie leaned against my shoulder. "This feels cozy." "It does." I looked around. Pizza boxes, blankets, couch cushions everywhere. Leo and Sophie were still laughing inside the fort. 6 months earlier, I would have apologized for the mess. Now, I wouldn't have changed a thing.